This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness. And I don't think that was too painful. I think we did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
And we are back with another episode of Art of Darkness, the podcast about the dark side of creativity. I am Brad Kelly. This is Kevin Kautzman. Kevin, how are you doing tonight, sir?
I'm great. I'm living a day of pandemonium here. It's all happening around the Coutzstead, the Owl House, as we call it. Very busy day, but I'm really excited for this episode. Brad, how are you?
I'm doing really good. Yeah, we're ready for pandemonium, which means like all the demons live here, something like that. But which is a coinage of John Milton. And that's who we're talking about. We're talking about John Milton. I guess
core
we'll just launch
episode.
into it.
This is a core episode.
Oh, yes, you're right.
Yeah.
This is a core episode. And I think I got a little bit to say. I almost have I don't want to say it's a disclaimer, but I got a little PSA about Milton and this episode. But first, I want to ask our opening question to you, Kevin. What do you know about John Milton?
Paradise Lost.
Yes.
Coined a lot of words.
Yeah.
I learned that recently.
Yeah.
In the English language, placed among Chaucer, Shakespeare as important in terms of the language. Very difficult to read. Not a fun time to crack open Paradise Lost. And you're made to feel like you ought to, certainly. What a poet. And I'm thinking 16th century.
A little bit later. Yeah.
17th?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
He
well,
was born in 1608. So
okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, hey, I'll forgive myself there. Hey, we don't know everything on Art of Darkness.
Yeah.
But English.
Yes.
And probably extremely English. And
yes. English in a way that probably his grandfather wasn't English, even though he wasn't born far from there, if that makes sense. And we'll talk about why that is.
Understood. I couldn't really even say where in England. And I assume that we're going to learn all of that on this episode, Brad. I cannot wait. I also know that Paradise Lost is quite famous for making the voice of the devil sympathetic. And
that's right. I like what you said about that's all right on, and we're gonna have a lot more detail on all those aspects. One thing that was interesting, you said it's one of these things you're made to feel like you're supposed to read or something. In my search, one of the many, many, many pieces of writing that I read in preparation for this was by from the BBC, which said why you should reread Paradise Lost. Like everyone has read this poem, but you should probably reread it. Like, what do you
That is state media for you. That
right,
is the beam.
Exactly.
I'm sure their average
funny.
reader is like, yes, I really should brush up on my Milton. I've lived in England. I've spent time over in England, and yes, I can confirm that they're all carrying around Paradise Lost and Canterbury Tales under their arms at all times. Yeah,
right.
Even very fancy, erudite, especially the chavs.
Right.
Boy, mate.
What's this about Satan, then, eh? Yeah.
Okay, no more accents on Art of Darkness. We like our listeners from across the pond.
Of course. Of course, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to do Milton. I wanted us and our audience to get a deeper appreciation and understanding of the lineage of English literature. So
I am jacked because this is important. This is I will confess, this is a bit of a knowledge gap for me. So I will get to learn along with our listeners. What are you going to do for the After Dark for Patreon? Yes. Patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Support the pod. You get extra stuff, including these After Darks. It's worth it. We make it worth it. What are you going to do for After Dark?
We're going to talk about Milton's. We're going to touch on it in the main episode, but we'll go into depth on Milton's relationship with his daughters, and it's a bit dark. And we're going to answer the question, what happened to John Milton's bones? And it's a surprisingly interesting answer. So we'll get into that. So that's for folks who, if people are just tuning in, this is the first episode you've listened to. How the show works, we're going to go for as long as it takes to tell the John Milton story, digging into his work. And then afterwards, for our beloved Patreon supporters, we're going to have this extra 20 to 30 minute, possibly a shade more than that content, patreon.com/artofdarkpod, where you will also get access to our book club meetings, where you can come hang out with us, talk about a book. Coming up very soon is House of Sleep, my book. We're covering that. But we're doing approximately one a month until the end of the year. So
yes, join us. And the big thing for the book club is in December, we're doing a Blood Meridian special with the great Aaron Gwynn. You're not going to want to miss it. I insisted we do Brad's book for the book club. It's also a banger. I've been rereading it here, getting ready for the club. Dude put a lot of work into this. And if nothing else, you should definitely check out his book, House of Sleep. It is worth reading. The book club's a really good time, and that's just part of Patreon. And you can be involved in the book club, or you can just go, oh, I'm just going to listen back to what these folks are talking about. You choose your level of involvement. Also, do not sleep on our Telegram channel. We have a very lively, very interesting Telegram channel. You have to imagine what Art of Darkness listeners talk about when 150 plus are in a chat room all together. It's a pretty wide range of things. Just like the pod, we cover Milton, we cover Frida Kahlo, we cover Burroughs, we covered Victor Grun, the guy who invented the mall. It's heterodox. This is a heterodox pod. And so go there, go to t.me/artofdarkpod. And I do want to shout out or give a mention to our good friend of the pod, Stephanie Leahy. I know she's going through something. Just want to say, Stephanie, we love you. We care about you very much, and we hope you're doing well.
Yeah, I second that.
She was on the famous Crowley episode. She's the one who carried me along as we discussed the great beast 666. And that's interesting too. I have no doubt that he was well versed in Milton.
I guarantee it. Yes. So let's get into it. So we've kind of talked about it, but let me just give a little bit of if you're listening to this and you're still sort of like, well, who cares about Milton, right? For fill in the blank reason, and just give you a few specifics. Dr. Samuel Johnson, who people may know, the famed English writer who practically invented literary criticism and was, some argued, was the most distinguished man of letters in English history. Despite his critiques of Milton, and he had a number of them, basically said that he was the one English poet that one had to keep coming back to. And he didn't say that about Shakespeare. Now, he didn't say anything bad about Shakespeare, but it wasn't. Milton was to Samuel Johnson perhaps on a higher tier. Similarly, writers like Wordsworth, Blake, Shelley, Keats, many others, countless really, think of him or thought of him as a forebearer, even though, as the professor John Rogers says, he was a difficult and demanding one. His best known work, Paradise Lost, is kind of that, and we're going to talk in detail about Paradise Lost, of course. It's that kind of rare volume of literature that not only has this enormous influence, on writing, but also seeps into having like theological and religious significance. It's not so much that he maybe changed the church or anything like that, but I think he populated the imaginations of a lot of religious people with images and concepts that perhaps weren't there before. Some of them are
Kanye West.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. John Milton, Kanye West. It's practically the same episode. No, but it's a good. But we're gonna see how that happened. But there is a way in which, a person could, and this is, I said at the beginning I was gonna have a little bit of a disclaimer, and let me do it now. It's kind of a two-parter, and I don't know if this is a disclaimer or not. But one, there's a lot of this is a very religious subject, and I'm not trying to, lean one way or the other. I'm just trying to present what Milton was up to. So, this is, if you end up hating this guy for his religious heresy, that's okay. I mean, this isn't an argument for anything that he believes necessarily, right? Just setting that
heresy police.
Yeah.
We're coming
yell
for
at,
you with our beads. We're
yell
ready.
at Milton. Don't yell at me.
I feel like that could be a new bingo card for spot for next year. The heresy police.
Right.
Heresy spotted.
Yeah, it's gonna get weird, I think, on the religious element a little bit.
Well, that period too. I mean,
that's part of it. Yeah,
that's the kickoff. Yeah. I mean, it's getting real, and we still live in the wake of that. A lot of people point to the Enlightenment, but it kind of kicked off. Mm-hmm. This is where modernism kicked off. Modernity, if not modernism, modernity kicked off right around here.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Milton is basically considered the first great writer of modern English for a lot of people. This is technically early modern English if you get into the linguistic taxonomies. But yeah.
I was just pulling that out of my hat, so I'm glad I was right.
Yeah, you're the man. And the other thing I want to say too is, before we get into this, Milton. There are a number of academics who've made their whole career on Milton. I literally watched an entire semester of lectures on Milton in the last month, right?
Okay. Brad watches an entire semester of lectures on Milton and summarizes it for you so you don't have to. If that's not worth $5 a month, $10 a month, I don't know what is. Patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Alternatively, if you're not a Patreon person, you can go to the website, and if you want to give us a one-time donation, PayPal, there's a link there. Support the pod. Go on, Brad. You were saying, so you watched academics and
Okay. My point is, there's been a lot of thought about Milton, and I'm going to gloss over things that some people are going to think are very important. I'm going to emphasize stuff that maybe some people don't think is super important. My point is, this is a huge topic in a lot of ways, and we're going to do our best to get through it. And I think there's a great story here, and I'm going to try to tell it to you. But just we know that there is an infinite chaos of Miltonia out there, and we're going to touch as much of it as we can.
I'm preparing Dante next. Mm-hmm. Fair to say Dante is like the Italian corollary to Milton in English?
For sure. Yeah.
Roughly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, then
So
these two episodes will pair well together.
They will. They absolutely will. And Milton was very much aware of Dante. Okay. Now, continuing on, why are we talking about Milton? We've got this religious aspect, the way that some people you could even conceive or make an argument that Paradise Lost is a religious text, in like not a text about religion, but an actual religious text. I'm not making that argument, but people have. Let's see what else. Also, some people will say that without Milton, the trajectory of the development of speculative literature, such as science fiction and fantasy, would have been radically different. I don't know if that's that. I don't know how strong the argument is there, but he was certainly participating in it's a fantasy epic as a genre is what Paradise Lost is. Now, you can talk about the religious truth of it, but as a format, as a genre, as a medium, it's essentially a fantasy epic. Okay. Going on. The coinage thing, very interesting. Let me read something about this really quick. Here are some words that he came up with, or he was the first person to really use. And some of these are just, what's that? Bussin'. He said no cap. He's some of these are just using the word in a new context that it hadn't been used in before, but as like now that context is how we use it. Infuriate. Let's see. Chastening, civilizing, pandemonium, satanic, divorceable, liturgical. Pedagogism, prelatry, like prelates. I might be saying that incorrectly. Let's see, lovelorn, ecstatic, endearing, sensuous.
I should call her.
Yeah, I know it's getting hot in here. Debauchery, depravity, and supposedly extravagance or flutter, like if you have a flutter in your stomach. Without Milton, there'd be no cooking, or hurried, things you wouldn't call things well balanced. We wouldn't have the word economize. You would never say that you were half starved. You would never say something you had eaten unhealthily. He came up with the word padlock. He came up with untack for untacking horses, unfurling banners, acclaim, dismissive. Supposedly criticize. So you're talking about a guy who, not by himself, but as part of a movement, you're talking about a guy who basically invented modern English, one of the inventors of modern English in a lot of ways. So you can imagine it is a little difficult to read because he's teetering on the edge of legibility for us. You know, he's putting things out there that we take for granted now, but to his contemporaries must have also been a little like, wait, what's cooking? You know, like it's very strange. Now, okay.
How many languages did this dude speak?
It's not exactly clear, but he was very fluent, particularly reading. I think he read them in more than he spoke them necessarily, but sure. Latin, Greek, Italian, French, probably a handful of others.
Probably German as well.
Probably. It would not surprise me if it was if he also knew German. Started learning Latin at 7. Now
we've got to return. We've got to return to Latin. And I'm quite serious. If you're a young person or you have, you're raising young people, I strongly recommend Latin, even for half a year. You don't need to devote your life to Latin necessarily, but just getting a year of it will change your perspective on the English language.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. I wish I had done more of it, for sure.
There's still time, Brad.
Yeah, there is, sort of. Now, this is not to say that Milton is not without his critics. He's had an outsized sounds like overrated. He has had an enormous influence on English letters, and even a lot of his critics, who, for reasons we'll find out, think he was personally repulsive, that he was a heretic, and even had issues with some of his poems. Almost everybody still sort of gives him the crown in a way, right? It's like Milton was great and he was this and that, right? So, like, for instance, William Blake said that he was party of the devil. That basically, though Milton didn't really know it, he had the devil talking in his ear. But also said that Milton was a true poet. So you've always got this kind of this tension going on in any analysis of Milton. T.S. Eliot, a little closer to our time, he also does this kind of thing where he sort of gives a lot of credit to Milton, but he also has very harsh things to say. I'm going to read a couple bits from T.S. Eliot. Kind of maybe weird to start with a T.S. Eliot quote instead of a Milton quote, but nonetheless. Quote, and he's talking about Milton here. As a man, he is antipathetic, either from the moralist's point of view or from the theologian's point of view or from the psychologist's point of view or from that of the political philosopher, or judging by the ordinary standards of likableness in human beings, Milton is unsatisfactory. The doubts which I have to express about him are more serious even than these. His greatness as a poet has been sufficiently celebrated, though I think largely for the wrong reasons. His misdeeds as a poet have been called to attention, but usually in a passing. What seems to me necessary is to assert at the same time his greatness and the serious charge to be made against him in respect of the deterioration, the peculiar kind of deterioration to which he subjected the language. So T.S. Eliot thinks he committed crimes against English, basically. Here's another bit from Eliot. The most important fact about Milton, for my purpose, is his blindness. Now, Milton was blind for like the last 20 years of his life, including when he wrote Paradise Lost. Eliot continues, I do not mean that to go blind in middle age is itself enough to determine the whole nature of a man's poetry. Blindness must be considered in conjunction with Milton's personality and character and the peculiar education which he received. It must also be considered in connection with his devotion to and expertness in the art of music. Had Milton been a man of very keen senses, I mean of all the five senses, his blindness would not have mattered so much. But for a man whose sensuousness, such as it was, had been withered early by book learning, it mattered a great deal. Now, there's a little bit here. Now, there's a bit, he says at some point in that, I'm not going to keep reading it, but he says at some point in that Eliot, nothing in Milton's Paradise Lost is an image. That basically not only was Milton actually blind in the real world, but in his imagination, he had no ability to see. We're going to find out if that's actually true.
One of these guys who can't imagine an apple.
Right. That's kind of what T.S. Eliot's trying to say. And yeah, and we'll when we get into Paradise Lost, that's one thing I want to kind of bump up against is like, is that actually true? Are we seeing anything? So anyway, let's one thing we haven't mentioned yet. Milton was also enormously important to English politics in his time. We're going to get to why, but like he trying to pose it just correctly. He worked for a post-revolutionary government and like a very high position. We're going to get to how that came to be and what the sort of implications and outcome of that were. But not only, this would be like, who's a non-elected but powerful government official? Just name one.
Not an unelected, the Norel Vocal, the woman who heads the CDC drug department.
Okay.
She's a lot. This is what they talk about when they talk about the quote unquote deep state. Yeah. I know her. I know of her because she's like Trotsky's great granddaughter.
Okay, right.
And she's in this really critical position around like drug policy and drug addiction policy.
Yeah.
So that's fun. Fun fact.
Right. Imagine if she retired from that position and then wrote Moby Dick. You'd be like, wait, what? Who?
Sure.
Wait, what is this person?
Right.
Like,
what is this? Yeah. Very interesting.
Right. So that's the kind of thing we're dealing with here. Right. Okay. So we'll just get into the basics here, set you up.
The real spicy answer would have been Joe Biden, but I stayed away from that. I'm just speculating. That would have been would have been a very spicy answer.
We're going to see that their times in Milton's time is similar to our time in many ways. I think you'll see some correspondences.
Nothing changes.
Yeah. So John Milton was born December 9th, 1608 in London, the Bread Street ward, which is in those days was, a largely working class district. Milton's own house that he grew up in was called the Spread Eagle, because that was the sign hung over the shop downstairs.
Huh.
And the Spread Eagle was the emblem of the worshipful company of scriveners. Milton's father was a very successful scrivener, also a goldsmith, and according to some ways of looking at it, this was sort of before the invention of banks, if you can imagine going back that far. He would have also been sort of like a pawnbroker. Like if you needed money, you went to John Milton's dad. He loaned, he took some piece of jewelry you had or something, and he loaned you money and you paid him back.
I just looked up Bread Street Ward, and if this is the same place, this is like right smack dab in the center of London, right next to like St. Paul's Cathedral. I mean, this is
yeah. He was right. He was right. He was right near St. Paul's Cathedral for sure.
Yeah, I love walking around that town.
Yeah.
So all this history just gets me so.
I imagine
excited.
There's something there that is still extant from this time. There's got to be something.
Oh, for sure.
There.
Yeah, there's a vibe. For sure. We got to go. We've got to do a Art of Darkness live in London at some point. We got to put that energy out there.
Yeah.
Put that energy out there. It'll be good.
Invite us.
It's going to be fun. I love that. That's a fun town.
Yeah. Now, his father, John Milton's father, was so he had this role as he was a scrivener, goldsmith, etc. But he was also interested in the arts. He was a trustee of Blackfriars Playhouse. This is, for people who may know, this is an indoor theater in which Shakespeare worked in his later years. John Milton Sr. was also a talented musician, could play the small organ and the bass viola. Milton Sr. had been the son of a Catholic and had been disinherited by John Milton's grandfather as a young man. So there was a split in the family between the Catholicism and Protestantism. This left Milton Sr., John Milton's father, to become a self-made man, which he accomplished. And it would be enough that basically our John Milton could be a trust fund kid in his early 20s. We're gonna get. I
was gonna say this is Dad has a link in Wikipedia here.
Yes, a little bit. Okay. Yeah. Now, of course, the John Milton we're covering has risen to much higher prominence, but at the time,
okay,
yeah, he's a player. His dad probably had met Shakespeare at one point, that sort of thing. Okay, now I said this is going to get religiously complicated. We do need to probably do just like a tiny bit of religious history, or else a lot of this stuff isn't going to make any sense. So I don't really know where to. Hopefully, this is enough detail for people who aren't familiar with this era, and hopefully, it's interesting. So 1608, Milton is born. 1517 is when Martin Luther publishes the 95 Theses, the famous pounding them on the door of the church. That probably stands in as good as anything as the beginning of the Reformation, though there was rumblings and trends.
Go back. You don't know what you're doing.
Now, if we look specifically in English, I mean, there's a whole category of, quote, English Reformation. Obviously, Martin Luther wasn't in England, for people who aren't aware of that. So it spread and eventually lands in England. Where it really kind of comes to prominence in England is when King Henry VIII, who was the king from 1509 to 1547, he wanted to have his marriage annulled, and Pope Clement VIII refused. So largely in response to this, King Henry VIII instituted Reformation Parliament, which abolished papal authority and positioned himself as the head of the Church of England. So it didn't have a whole lot to do with... It was also a
huge land grab. Everybody likes to point at he wanted to get the
that's because it's this one thing you can like,
right? Yeah, a wedge, and now the crown owns all of the papal, all of the properties all throughout the realm.
Yeah. So from that time, the Church of England became more and more Protestant until the reign of Queen Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, from 1553 to 1558. Who restored Catholicism and put England back under papal jurisdiction. I'm
going to try to stay neutral here because I want to say too many things.
I know. I'm just trying to get through this to keep you. I'm trying to what is that? When you just throw a lot of words at somebody, gish gallop. So you can't stick in there.
I don't want guys showing up at my door with like balaclavas.
Right. so basically the way to there's a not an end to this, but a worthwhile stopping point, at least for the English Reformation, is when Queen Elizabeth I enacted, or under Queen Elizabeth, there was the Elizabethan religious settlement in 1603, which 5 years before Milton was born. And this is basically a law that, this is too simple of a way to put it, but for our purposes, it basically made Catholicism illegal in England around 1603. Now, people were still Catholics there, but it was, the law was on the books as you were not supposed to practice this.
Yeah,
right?
Famous, went underground.
Yeah, right. Now, Milton's grandfather had been Catholic, but his father had not been, and there'd been a big division in the family. Milton grew up attending the Church of All Hallows just down the street. He was baptized by a respected Puritan minister. Interesting to note, though, despite the fact that Milton wrote Paradise Lost, in adulthood, he basically never attended church. And some scholars, at some point he would call into question basically every Christian tenet at some point. It's a little difficult in some ways to ask what were Milton's religious ideas. You have to kind of ask what month and year it is when you're asking the question, right? How was he 12 or was he 50? It makes a huge difference. But some scholars have suggested that in Milton's head, he didn't need to go to church of any kind because he was really the only true Christian. So that's the kind of dude we're dealing with. Now,
the logic, it is sort of the logical consequence of Protestantism. It's sort of for many. It relates to sort of sola scriptura. Like we've got to find this ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's not, there's something to that. Of course, Milton thinking he's the only one, that's probably, you can't really have a church of one.
Right. Now, he never said that. This is sort of people cobbling it together. But the fact that he did basically call into question every teaching at some point or another. Yeah. So, okay, Boyhood. This is a time where public education isn't really a thing. People probably already know that. But John Milton was provided with a home tutor. Actually, a number of them. Chief among them was this guy named Thomas Young, who was a Scottish Presbyterian minister and theologian, who actually would later, this is a guy Milton would know for most of his life and would play a role in some of the political entanglements later on. Milton would learn Latin at age 7, and he was pretty serious about, I almost said education, but he was actually critical. He was actually skeptical about educational institutions, but he was very serious about learning. And let me give you a couple of things. We'll start to hear his voice now. Here's from Paradise Regained. This Paradise Regained is Paradise Lost 2 Electric Boogaloo. From Paradise Regained, he says, quote, "When I was a child, no childish play to me was pleasing. All my mind was set serious to learn and know, and thence to do what might be public good." Okay, now here's another thing he says in Aeropagitica, which we're going to talk about, a hugely important document of political philosophy. Quote, "Books are not absolutely dead things, but do contain a potency of life in them to be as active as that soul whose progeny they are. Nay, they do deserve, as in a vial, the purest efficacy and extraction of that living intellect that bred them. A good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life."
Wow.
Yeah, I quite like that.
That's beautiful. Yeah, we are book respecters on the pod.
Yes.
Did you want to mention your source material too for the episode?
Oh yeah, thanks. I definitely meant to. I appreciate that. My biggest probably there's like 120 books on Milton. So I didn't read all of them. My biggest one is John Milton, a biography by this gentleman named Neil Forsyth. Quite good. Not super long, but good. Well put together. And of course, Paradise Lost, then the notes, commentary, and the first Milton biography by his nephew, Edward Phillips, are in here.
Wow, that's a door stopper.
Yeah. And then major works, a couple things in here biographically, and then there's a couple little readings and poems I'll do. And then probably the other big one, I've got a couple of scattered articles that I'll mention the name of when we come to them. And another big one is the lecture series on Milton by John Rogers from Yale. That's free on YouTube. It's really good. John Rogers is great. So check that out if you feel like you need more Milton. Okay, so 1620.
Milton, I got a fever.
Go ahead.
I need more Milton. I need more Milton.
You guys might be. Hopefully, people do after this, and they're not sick of it. It's going to be interesting. 1620. Milton attends a school associated with St. Paul's Cathedral, and it is around this time that he became obsessive for language and literature. This is probably 12 years old. Here he learned under a man named Alexander Gill, who is an English grammarian, spelling reformer, and ardent anti-Catholic. He's going to come up a little later, too. He gets into pretty big trouble, Alexander Gill. But Alexander Gill, for instance, in 1623, once wrote a poem celebrating the collapse of a church that killed 90 Roman Catholics.
Oh,
so that was
very nice.
That was okay to just write a poem about that at that time.
Yeah.
Okay. Milton makes a good friend at St. Paul's named Charles Diodati. This is probably his closest. This is probably like his best friend, somebody he knew from childhood into adulthood. Diodati is the nephew of a distinguished Calvinist scholar who was the first man to translate the Bible into Italian. And this relationship is, and we're going to read a letter he wrote to Charles Diodati at one point because it contains sort of his earliest poetic manifesto, I guess. But this relationship to Charles Diodati, for people who are suspicious of Milton's either homoeroticism or just neurotic sexuality, they often point to this relationship of Diodati as being like some kind of sublimated romance at the very least. So kind of interesting. There also is a thing that seems to be happening for Milton when he's a teenager. And we might go into more detail on this later. He basically at some point decides, sometime in his teen years or very early 20s, he decides that there's a special place in heaven reserved for poets. And there's even a specialer place in heaven reserved. This is how John Rogers puts it, more or less.
Podcasters.
Yeah, right. Reserved for poets. Oh, wait, no. This is to, there's a special place in heaven reserved for poets. And to be a great poet, you must be a virgin. I don't know how.
What?
Yeah. So.
Wait, so he's a Volcel?
For a while. Yeah. Now, what's interesting, he has this thing. So he's very strict with himself about this. But he's also, in his teen years, in his reading and some of the stuff he writes, he's clearly interested in violence. And I'm not saying that he's a violent person by any means, because he never was. But you can tell that there's the 1600s equivalent of watching action movies kind of thing going on. Not necessarily bad, but just kind of interesting. He seemed to pay special note to battles and acts of violence and slaughters and things like that. It's kind of interesting.
Was he a war guy? Because you have war guys where you'll be hanging out and suddenly we're talking about
he did write like the first history of Britain, so he probably was very interested in that sort of thing.
You're painting a very interesting picture of this fellow.
He is quite the dude. Yeah.
Okay.
He is something else, man. He really is. Now, in his teen years, these in teens into 20s, he's starting to formulate this notion. Like I said, he's got this religious notion of poets go to heaven. All poets go to heaven. And the best poets are virgins. But he's sort of deciding to himself that, like, and he has a great quote that he's going to write a verse that would outlive him. He's going to write something that will not be forgotten. That's his life goal starting sometime in his late teens, that he's going to be known forever.
I think quite a few people are like that, still share that. There's an artistic motivation to say, I'm gonna create something that they're gonna be contending with 100 years from now, 500 years from now. Now you're on another level. For real. So he was setting out to do this quite early, and he was serious about it. Like this wasn't just like, he's hanging out with his buddies and it's like, I'm going to write a really good poem. He was like, I'm going to point everything about my life
towards being a great poet. But there's some distractions, and we're going to get to them. Okay, so first stop along this path after normal, the school, the St. Paul's Cathedral School, is he attends Christ College, Cambridge. Goes there in February of 1625, expecting to be shown into a world of just revelatory education and insight and knowledge, and he ends up being fairly disappointed.
It's not the University of Texas at Austin, but it's a good school. I've heard Cambridge is a good school.
I think that's a good school. Yeah. This is also an interesting time, and I just need to peg this because we need to. The story of Milton is the story of England in his time, right? So I need to keep you abreast of historical happenings as we're going. So 1625. It's
very similar to Frida. Sorry, it's very similar to the episode we just did, Frida Kahlo.
Yeah. It's not that it is similar in a lot of ways. Yeah. So 1625, same year Milton starts at Christ College, Cambridge. King James I dies and Charles I is crowned. This is going to be significant. Charles I is like a antagonist for Milton in a lot of ways. The other thing that happens in 1625, there is an outbreak of the plague that kills 1/6 of the city. This kind of thing happens more than once in Milton's life. It's interesting to read this great biography by Neil Forsyth, and it'll just sort of be like, yeah, and then there was a plague and like 1/5 of the city died, and then moving on. We're like, what? Hold on.
Hold the fort.
Yeah, exactly.
I just had a thought. It's interesting.
Yeah.
So when Charles I pops up, do you think they call him Charles I right away, or do you think they just call him Charles?
I think they got to call him just Charles, right?
Right. If you started calling me like Kevin the First, I'd be like, well, who's Kevin the Second?
Right. Yeah. What are you trying to say? Is there somebody angling for my job? Like
off of your head.
That's ironic, considering what happens to Charles I, which we'll get to. Okay. Picture of John Milton right now at this age, young man, 18 years old. He has longish hair. He wears his hair long compared to other people. He's very handsome. He tends to look quite a bit younger than he actually is until sort of he gets into middle age. And apparently quite the looker. Of course, we don't have a photograph of him. And one of the handful of images we have of him taken from the time was botched by this engraver, so it's not accurate. But apparently, attractive man. I like this idea of the long hair. One of the last pieces Milton will write is a play about Samson. People who know Samson's all about having the strength in the hair. And there's other things that are kind of going on at Cambridge. Okay, so he's starting to do. He's engaged on this task of mastering all the things he would need to know and understand in order to be a great poet. Early on, we start to already see like this Milton mode of writing poetry that is religious and political and aesthetic, and it's all of these things together. I think in many, many ways, to him, these were all, there was a commonality between all of them, right? A proper religion would be best expressed poetically, and a great story has political implications. These things all swim together. So on that note, I want to read a fairly early poem by him. This is, in Latin. This is when he was still writing in Latin. He hadn't been writing in English much at this point. He writes the poem In Quintum Novembris, which is in English is on the 5th of November, composed in 1626. So he would have been 18. This poem celebrates the anniversary of the failed gunpowder plot of 1605, when Guy Fawkes was discovered preparing to detonate explosives at the opening of Parliament, an event in which King James I and his family would participate. On the event's anniversary, university students typically composed poems that attacked Roman Catholics for their involvement in treachery of this kind. Yeah. Okay. You're gonna have a hard one on
this. Got it.
You're gonna have a hard time on this episode. Okay, let me read a little bit of this poem though, so we can finally really get something in Milton's voice. This is I'm not gonna read the whole thing, but I'm just gonna read like one sort of stanza.
Guy Fawkes is one of the coolest names of all time, by the way.
It is.
It's a
I
very
thought,
cool name.
I thought maybe his sort of the
That
meaning
guy
of it has changed.
Fawkes.
He did Fox.
What were you going to say?
I thought I knew that it was celebrated over there, but not really understanding the historical context. I thought they were celebrating that the plot happened.
Yeah, truly.
Apparently, they were celebrating that the king survived.
Yes, yeah. Well, that as an American, that seems
right.
all upside down.
Well, no, we wouldn't. We would be like, we're not going to celebrate something good. Like
you're telling me this state dodged a bullet.
Yeah, right. And then they have a party.
It'd be like celebrating the day that Reagan wasn't assassinated. Like he got shot, but he didn't die, and you celebrate that.
Yeah, you have a party every year. It is a little odd.
Really track for us. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a quote from this poem on the 5th of November. Quote: "There is a place begirt with the darkness of an eternal night, the vast foundations of a building long in ruins, now the den of cruel murder and double-tongued treachery, whom raging discord brought forth at one birth. Here amid chips of stone and broken rocks lie unburied the bones of men and corpses pierced with steel. Here dark guile sits with distorted eyes. Here are seen strife and calumny with fanged jaws, and fury and death in 1,000 forms, and fear. About the place flies horror, and the bodiless shades perpetually cry through the deep silence. The conscious earth is stagnant with blood. In the innermost recesses of the cave, murder and treason lie fearfully lurking, and though none pursues them through the cavern of horrors and jagged rocks, dark with funereal shadows, with backward glances the guilty pair retreats. The high priest of Babylon summons these Roman bullies who have been faithful through long years, and thus addresses them." Okay, and then we have, I'm not going to read it, but then he basically has a version of his later Satan talking to the conspirators of November the 5th. So interesting stuff. We can kind of see where he's going with this sort of thing.
That sounds thoroughly modern. That sounds like heightened. That's language I didn't have to struggle to understand what was being said.
And a lot of times, what's tricky, and here's what I think. I think what T.S. Eliot's critique of Milton about the damage he did to the language wasn't so much the words or which words he chose and what he, and how he implemented them. It was really syntax. So Eliot was saying, and this is further brought to the fore in Paradise Lost, even more so in these early poems. These early poems are in Latin, translated to English by somebody else usually. And so he's not at the dawn of an invented language, right? He's playing in an old tradition. Later on, when he's writing more in English, I think Eliot's complaint is that he often distorted syntax to make things work on the sound level, on the level of sound, and that in doing so, he often made things much more obscure than they had to be, which it's hard to put yourself back into 1674 and understand what it would have sounded like. But to me, when I struggle with, say, Paradise Lost, it's because I'm reading 3 or 4 lines and I'm like, oh, that's the subject of the sentence. Okay. And
right.
It's
yeah.
So
is it meant to be read aloud, Paradise Lost?
Well, I think all poetry is to a certain degree. Yeah, for sure. I'm sure people were reciting it to each other. Absolutely. Somebody out there somebody back then probably memorized it. It's kind of insane.
That sounds like a real fun night in ye old London. My mates and I are going to read Paradise Lost. Indeed. Okay. Indeed. Yeah. How much booze will there be?
Not enough.
Not enough.
So Milton at Cambridge. We're actually going to get to a good beer drinking story here in a minute. Milton was a talented student. I mean, he's a smart guy. Again, we're dealing with a guy who very, very, very bright. So even if we disagree with him, we got to give him credit where credit's due. He was, again, skeptical of the institution of education. He was not yet the radical that he's going to become. And there's an incident, but he's sort of getting more serious and more I guess, self-possessed. There's an incident in 1627 where Milton was a student of this man named William Chappell, who's a popular teacher. And nobody knows exactly what happened, but Milton was rusticated after this incident, which means he was sent home, basically, I think, for like a semester. It likely has something to do with the fact that Chappell was a Arminian. That's not an Armenian, but an Arminian, which is a sort of an antinomian thought, a theological stance. But suffice to say, for our purposes, it means that he believed in at least some amount of free will. This William Chappell guy did. And at this time, Milton was a staunch predestinarian.
Aha.
Okay. Now, it's worth thinking about that these things that like we now have a conversation like, do you think we have free will or not? And people are like, I don't know, dude. Like literally that used to be like the underlying cause of like mass violence.
Knife you over this. Yeah.
Yeah,
no, true.
exactly.
I mean, this is
yeah.
It still matters doctrinally and
it's important
theologically. You really 100%. Have to. Yeah.
Okay, so it turns out though that Milton gets rusticated. This is actually what he wanted. Milton didn't really want to be in school. He is an autodidact. He's a guy who didn't need any structure to teach him. He needed access to good books and a pub. That's all that Milton needed to become Milton. So when he gets rusticated, he's back with his friends. He's got his books. He's able to go to the theater. He eventually does go back to school, but that's really the milieu he wants to be in. He was also a gifted musician. And by 1628, when he's 20 years old, he becomes, to some degree, the life of the party at Cambridge. Every year, they had this thing at Christ College that they called a salting. And the deal was that a freshman would have to give what they call a prolusion. Basically, you have to imagine a bunch of people at a tavern pounding on the table, drinking a lot of beer. And a freshman has to give a prolusion, which is they have to make an argument in front of everybody. And if it wasn't good enough, everybody would salt the freshman's beer. They would put salt in his beer. And of course, it wasn't about, because it's a beer drinking thing, it's more about how witty this prolusion was. So basically, you're bringing a freshman up and you're like, can you do a little stand-up routine for smart kids? And if it's not funny, we're going to pour salt in your beer. That's basically what's going on.
Sounds kind of fun.
It does sound kind of fun. Yeah. They were definitely having fun. 1628, Milton served as the master of ceremonies for this event and gives what appears to have been a very rousing prolusion that basically made an intricate mockery of the whole idea of having to do prolusions, right? Because of course he's going to always be operating on some other level. Let me read a little bit.
Just imagine like David Foster Wallace sitting in the corner taking notes and just overthinking.
Right. If I just did it like this, I could. Yeah. And I'm going to read this thing about this event from the biography. Quote, at one point in this merry performance, Milton refers to an earlier oration which he had thought would provoke his fellow students to dislike him. This was probably Prolusion 1. This is something you can go out and read if you'd like, in which it was Milton's job to argue for day in the debate over whether day or night is the most excellent. So you can imagine, like kid, come up, you got to argue why the day is better than the night, and it better be funny. Yeah,
cool. I dig it.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. He there insults anyone who would oppose him in this kind of exercise without the proper learning, since they soon run out of things to say, as dumb as the frogs of Seriphus. That's a Milton quote. Elsewhere, it's like early battle rap. It is.
It's sort of like high level trash talk.
Absolutely. And he actually thrived on being attacked, which is an interesting personality trait. Elsewhere, he also compares such people to Shakespeare's foolish Trinculo in The Tempest. We can see what Milton thought his audience might be hostile to, he thought his audience might be hostile to this kind of treatment, but it turns out that they rather enjoyed his wit, or so Prolusion 6 implies. The speech is the occasion for much juvenile joking, playing on the names of college officials and students, and poking fun at the students' sexual urges to play the father in Cambridge Town. In the same breath, he refers to his own role as, quote, father for the occasion, master of ceremonies, and jokes about the change from his habitual nickname of the Lady of Christ. And I wanted to get up to that point. His nickname in college was the Lady of Christ, or the Lady,
because of his hair.
His hair, and he was a virgin. And a lot of these other guys were going to brothels, and if they weren't actually getting laid, they certainly would have if they could. You know what I mean?
Right.
And Milton is
the superiority of the incel over the Vul cell. At least the incel's in the game.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
This guy, what a character. The great Peniel Collada did some show art for us. She does all of our epic portraits, and you'll see in the show art for this episode, he has wonderful locks, wonderful curling locks. They called him what? The Lady of the Church?
The Lady of Christ.
The Lady of Christ.
Yeah, and they shortened it to the Lady. But you can just imagine 1620 something, you're in a dark pub and he's up there telling jokes, and people are calling him the Lady and pounding on the table. That's the Lady. It's just, I love this little scene. In other prolusions that he did, and in Milton's later, he wrote a very influential treatise on education called On Education. He would take on the institution of Cambridge, which he would later articulate as monkish and miserable sophistry. And he would eventually charge the universities with bringing students to, quote, a hatred and contempt of learning, and making people who could not think for themselves susceptible to tyranny.
Ooh.
Yeah. Got a deep thinker.
Yeah, we've come a long way.
Yeah. Okay. Now, soon after the salting, though, in 1628, Milton starts to learn how serious the stakes in the intellectual game can actually be. It's one thing to be in a bar room where the whole thing is, can you make other people laugh, right? And who's the smartest in the room, that kind of thing. It's an interesting game, maybe for some people, and Milton certainly liked it. But soon he's going to learn that when you start playing that game more broadly, it can get for real. Now, we got to talk some English history here. During Charles I's reign, which started in 1625, Charles benefited from the loyalty of a man named George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham. The first Duke of Buckingham had been a, quote, favorite of King James I, and the first Duke of Buckingham claimed that he was James I's lover. So the general conception, the historical record seems to lean that James I had a sexual relationship with the first Duke of Buckingham, and people at the time probably knew that. It was probably in the rumor mill, certainly. Now, 3 years into the reign of Charles I, so 1628, the first Duke of Buckingham, this guy George Villiers, who's totally incompetent, was nearly impeached twice, but saved by the king, and was so diabolical that his doctor was once mobbed in the streets and killed. Right? Everybody hated the first Duke of Buckingham. He ends up being stabbed to death by a disgruntled army officer. They hated him. Now, while this stabbing was generally celebrated in public, most people thought this was good, that this guy had been stabbed in the street. Milton's friend, Alexander Gill, who we mentioned earlier, he publicly toasted the event and called Buckingham the king's Ganymede, which, for people who don't know, Ganymede is the old Greek idea of the older male and the younger male having a sexual relationship. That's that. Alexander Gill was then defrocked and was sentenced to have his ears cut off. He managed to get away without getting his ears cut off, but he did serve 2 years in prison, which I'm sure was a pleasant experience. So, and this is a guy that Milton knew personally. So you're starting to see that the point I guess I'm trying to make here is, as Milton starts to expand the game that he's playing, it's getting more dangerous. And it gets pretty dangerous as time goes on. Okay. As we're heading towards graduation, for a brief time, Milton was going to go to the church. If you get an MA, he got his MA in 1632. At this time, the list of jobs that you could get with an MA included minister, and that's pretty much it. So,
okay,
there's really nothing you could do with it. You could, I guess, teach maybe. So anyway,
nothing changes. Nothing changes.
Right.
Everybody acts like these are new problems.
His entire graduating class, when he got his MA in Cambridge, they all became ministers except for him. he probably didn't happen because a couple things. I think he was I don't think he was theologically on board to completely, at least enough to be a minister. I mean, later he doesn't even attend church. So we can see that aspect of it. Also, he really, really, really wanted to be a poet, which pleased his father to no end, as it usually does. Dad, I know you've invested in my education, but I've decided to tell you I'm going to be a poet.
going to dance.
Right. And even though his dad is like involved in the theater and plays music, he's still like, dude, really?
What?
Right. So, okay. There's a couple things that
coming together.
Yeah,
it's all coming
yeah,
together.
yeah. For years after he graduates Cambridge, his father supports him. He lives at home with mom and dad, and he pretty much just reads the whole time. Now, there is people who've said, and I don't think it's true, but the fact that even people even debate it tells us something, that Milton read everything available at in his time. Certainly impossible to do now. 1620s, it's a much smaller pool to draw from, but suffice to say, by the end of Milton's life, he's probably as well read or more well read than anyone else alive. I think that's fair. I don't even think anybody would really dispute that. He's certainly up there on a tier above basically everyone. And part of how he does this is for years, he doesn't have to have any kind of job. And he takes the reading serious, right? So anyway, he does get his first public poem appears in 1632. Interestingly, it's put in the front matter of the second folio of Shakespeare's plays. Now, you're an unpublished poet, nobody knows who you are. How do you get a piece of writing in the front matter of a book of Shakespeare? Well, your dad is basically on the board of the Blackfriars Theater. So, of course, tons of people owed his dad money in the theater community. So, of course, he's got a leg up. But anyway, it's interesting that that's his first public appearance, right? Already in conversation with Shakespeare. He's saying good things about Shakespeare. It's not like there's even a rivalry necessarily, at least at that point. But it's, I think, fitting that his first public piece of writing is essentially an introduction to the work of Shakespeare. There's a little bit of like a passing of the torch kind of thing, sort of beneath the surface. Okay, what else? Oh, so he's working for a while. He's doing this sort of I think it's been called the studious retirement when he graduates from Cambridge in 1932 for a number of years. But he does sometime after the Shakespeare folio poem or introduction, he gets commissioned to write a masque. Do you know what a masque is, Kevin? Masque.
I've heard of it. I have a vague idea. I'm the theater guy. I should know. It's a type of performance. I assume masks are involved.
Mm-hmm.
Is it sort of an Italian style?
Yes.
Drama.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Yes. Everything
Playwright.
Everything you said is right. So just stop there.
Nailed it.
Right. I think it kind of degenerated over time into sort of like the masked ball, right, where you just go to a party with a mask. But at the time, it was a theatrical performance with music written specifically for it, with essentially a play written specifically for it, with elaborate set designs. And these were commissioned by rich people, basically, of one kind or another, for you to come to their home and perform it in front of their friends.
And so sort of like site specific. Mm-hmm. Theater done in homes, but in big homes, ballrooms,
right? And it would be written to flatter the family, and it would also often, if anybody in the family wanted to participate, they would find backup dancer. You put the niece in as a backup dancer or whatever. Sure. It's those kinds of things. But
fun,
yeah, they were having a good time, I think. Mm-hmm. He writes what comes to be called Comus after one of the characters. This is a masque presented at Ludlow Castle commissioned for the entertainment of the Earl of Bridgewater, who had married the Countess of Derby. Okay. So Milton's Mask, as I said, Comus, this is 1634. Here's the deal with Comus. It concerns two brothers and their sister lost in the woods. They leave her to go find sustenance, I think. And she encounters the debauched Comus, a childlike Sartor figure from Greek lore. He lures her with charisma and then paralyzes her and tries to give her a drink that will overpower her with pleasure. Now, remember what Paradise Lost is
They
about.
meet a satyr. A satyr.
Satyr. Yeah. What did I say? Sartor? Oh, because I have Sartor written there.
No, it's all right. Yeah. No, it's all right. Fascinating. This is very interesting.
But so now think.
I mean, like, Horny Pan, the horny goat boy. Yeah.
But you think about this specific later, Adam and Eve, right? The serpent tempts Eve with the apple. Here we have Comus luring her into the woods with charisma to give her a drink that overpowers her. There's these similar, right? He's a little more pagan, motif, but yeah, it is. But like structurally, it's kind of the same, a similar story, right? She managed. Anyway, this character manages to stave this off. The mask was very successful and lived on for quite some time, which was unusual for a mask. In fact, in 1738, over 100 years later, the text was used as the basis for a very successful mask by the musician Thomas Arne, and that one ran continuously for 70 years. So pretty much Milton's first outing, he does a pretty, I mean, you imagine if the first significant thing you wrote 170 years later, people were still saying those words. You've already.
Do we call him a playwright then?
Well, I don't know if you call a person who wrote a mask a playwright. I suppose you do. Yeah. I didn't read this one just because there's so much to read. I just kind of skipped it. So I don't know how much it's. I know there are like soliloquies and that sort of thing. And then this is interesting. In 1745, the composer Handel provided a new musical arrangement for a performance of The Mask, once again at Ludlow Castle. Now, here's something I think that's interesting. We're going to tie this into my next topic I want to get into more. Who is the Earl of Bridgewater? Who are these people? Are they at all interesting? Well, kind of. Let me just give you a little bit of a reading from the Neil Forsyth biography.
I will tell you, when you go over to the old country, you go to the UK, and the first time you have to like try to get a bank account or something, or do something like that, and you go down to the drop down list, and it's over here it's Mr., Mrs., Doctor. You're lucky if you get a Miss. Over there it's Baron, Earl. All of those things are in there. Oh yeah. It's a trip. You go, okay. That's funny. What is all this?
That's just and it's funny, as an American, this stuff just all feels really made up, doesn't it? Just like Anyway,
fair enough.
Quote: the Bridgewater children, Alice in particular, had recently complained of demonic possession and had been treated with protective amulets and St. John's wort by the well-known physician John Napier. In a sense, then, the mask Comus that we just described replays her cure. The Earl himself, in his capacity as a judge, had recently given an extremely fair-minded ruling in a long drawn-out case of the rape of a 14-year-old girl, Marjorie Evans, by a powerful local official. This will have been in the minds of those present on this big occasion, more especially as Michaelmas was a holiday associated with public administration and justice. The lessons for the day, I'm skipping down. The gospel for the day, Matthew 18, denounces the man who offends against children. It were better for him that a millstone were hung about his neck and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Milton may not have known these details of the Bridgewater family when he first composed The Mask, though he will probably have noticed the uncanny connections at the time of the performance. So a little bit more. There was another reason why the subject of The Mask was extremely risky and needed to be handled with great delicacy. An extraordinary sexual scandal had recently afflicted the family of the Countess's eldest daughter, Anne. Her husband, the infamous Earl of Castlehaven, had had his servants frequently rape both his wife and his stepdaughter, who is married to his own son. He was also accused of sodomy and, even worse, popery. He was executed in May 1631. The Dowager Countess was now supporting Anne and her daughter. Milton made tactful reference to her role in Arcades, but in Comus, given the subject, he had to be careful not to insult his hosts, and especially not the young virgin playing the lady. So this daughter of the Earl of Bridgewater played the main role in Comus, and she was 15 years old. In particular, he had to avoid having the references to rape and chastity seem ironic. So, on that sort of topic of sexuality, we discussed Milton as being voluntarily celibate, but let's kind of dig into this a little bit more. As I said, some scholars have suggested that Milton perhaps was homosexual, at least had homoerotic leanings. This is largely because of things he said about Charles Diodati, or in letters to Charles Diodati. Though the romance in them seems like very, to me, reading them, and we're not going to dig into it because there's just not enough time to cover everything. They seems like platonic friendship, but written in capital R romantic terms. To me, it doesn't. But what do I know? What we can say is that Milton, up into the late 30s at least, so well into his 20s, is committed to chastity. He has, again, as we've said, is sort of so dedicated to poetry that all the other things go out the window, and he's convinced himself that chastity is significant. Somebody at one point even wrote, and I couldn't verify this, so I don't want to make a big point of it, but that he was even vegetarian for a time, which seems to me is highly unusual in this time period. Whatever the case, very serious, very dedicated guy. Let's read his little bit of his not quite his manifesto, but this is a sort of a statement of what he's up to from this late 1630s, written to Charles Diodati. Just finding the page.
He's in his 20s now at this point.
Yeah, he would be in his early to mid 20s. This is during his period of studious reading a lot.
What a character. Long hair, living at home, going to be a poet, fresh out of Cambridge. Everybody else is going to be a minister.
Right.
And we're writing masks and hobnobbing and
Right. And one thing is, too, he was so sort of chaste after school, after Cambridge, that the biographers say even though he wrote that mask, he'd probably never been to one, which is just interesting, right? Okay, so here's from Milton's letter to Charles Diodati in this is a little bit later, 1637. So in this letter he'd be 19 or so. Quote, "For though I do not know what else God may have decreed for me, this certainly is true. He has instilled into me, if into anyone, a vehement love of the beautiful. Not so diligently is Ceres, according to the fables, said to have sought her daughter Proserpina, as I seek for this idea of the beautiful, as if for some glorious image, throughout all the shapes and forms of things. Day and night I search and follow its lead eagerly, as if by certain clear traces. Whence it happens that if I find it anywhere, one who, despising the warped judgment of the public, dares to feel and speak and be that which the greatest wisdom throughout all the ages has taught to be the best, I shall cling to him immediately from a kind of necessity. But if I, whether by nature or by my fate, am so equipped that I can by no effort and labor of mine rise to such glory and height of fame, still I think that neither men nor gods forbid me to reverence and honor those who have attained that glory, or who are successfully aspiring to it. But now I know you wish your curiosity satisfied. You make many anxious inquiries, even about what I am thinking. Listen, Diodati, but in secret, lest I blush, and let me talk to you grandiloquently for a while. You ask what I am thinking of, so help me God. I am thinking of immortality, of fame. What am I doing? Growing my wings and practicing flight. But my Pegasus still raises himself on very tender wings. Let me be wise on my humble level. I shall now tell you seriously what I am planning to do. To move into some one of the inns of court, wherever there is a pleasant and shady walk, for that dwelling will be more satisfactory, both for companionship, if I wish to remain at home, and as a more suitable headquarters if I choose to venture forth. Where I am now, as you know, I live in obscurity in cramped quarters with his parents. You shall also hear about my studies, By continued reading, I have brought the affairs of the Greeks to the time when they ceased to be Greeks. I have been occupied for a long time by the obscure history of the Italians under the Longobards, Franks, and Germans, to the time when liberty was granted them by Rudolph, King of Germany. From there, it will be better to read separately about what each state did by its own effort. But what about you? How long will you act the son of the family and devote yourself to domestic matters, forgetting urban companionships? For unless this stepmotherly warfare be more hazardous than either the Dacian or Sarmatian, you must certainly hurry and at least make your winter quarters with us. Okay, so just gives us a sense of he's 19 years old, and he basically tells his best friend, like, listen, this is embarrassing, but I want to be famous. Not famous. I want to be immortal. And I'm going to do that by gathering all of the knowledge that I can. Right. So
he reminds me in his monomania of the character of the judge. That with which exists without my knowledge exists without my consent.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of that in Milton.
I think there's some truth to that. Yeah. He's probably a little less harsh. But in terms of, the megalomania, I think there's some real truth to that. It's very interesting. Okay, so he has to be working on stuff, though, right? He writes this Comus. He's got a couple other poems. Paradise Lost, however, is still 30-some years away. In 1637, Milton composes what many scholars consider to be his first major work, and this is the pastoral elegy. I should have looked up how to pronounce this, so I got it right. Lycidas? Lycidas, Lycidas, I believe. Anyway, this is a 193-line poem of irregular rhyme, written in English, not Latin, dedicated to the memory of his Cambridge pal, Edward King, whose ship sank in the Irish Sea. This is incorporated into a 1638 collection of elegies for this young man, Edward King. And while most of the poems are these sort of, they basically imitated John Donne. They're sort of witty and metaphysical. Milton chose the pastoral elegy, which a modern reader wouldn't realize this, but it was a completely obsolete genre when he wrote this. So it would be like right now if somebody came out with a like what's a famous musical from like the golden era of Hollywood, like
Guys and Dolls.
It's like if you came out with Guys and Dolls and you weren't doing it ironically,
but no irony, just straight ahead.
Yeah, people would be like, wait, what? Yeah,
Dudes and Dames,
right?
A new American musical.
So and we'll see this too later when he writes Paradise Lost. That was sort of an obsolete genre too. Like he's doing this strange thing where he's like stylistically
anachronistic. He's playing
right. He's sort of innovating on one hand, but he's doing it within stuff that most people have already moved beyond, which is an interesting formula. I think for somebody who's trying to figure out a creative project, that could be just an interesting experiment to run.
Yeah, not to keep circling back to Blood Meridian, but there's an interesting thing he did with the chapter headers where they reflect something that was done during the period, but then kind of subverts and twists it a little bit. Yeah,
right.
There's a lot of rich creative juice out of playing with, I'll say it again, anachronistic styles, so sort of like old-timey strange things. Like what if you were to write a masque now? I read a little bit about it in the background, Brad. Apparently it came out of a tradition where players would show up at a nobleman's house unbidden, probably a little wink on the sly, probably a little bit like, shall we have a masque tonight? Maybe kind of, maybe they knew they were coming, maybe they didn't, and they would show up and then perform something for the family, right? Mm-hmm. No TV, no radio, no Netflix. So here these players show up and then they would unmask themselves at the end, and presumably there'd be food and a tip and whatever else. What if you wrote something like that now? Right. Or use that as a launching point for an idea. There you go. Now you're in a structure that you can play with.
Yeah, exactly. And you can there's always more to be wrung from, like, we think that these old formats are tired, but they're not. They still have juice, right? They all do.
Yeah, there's a reason they worked for hundreds of years. There's a reason that one performance went on for 70 years. They work. Dramaturgy is is machinery, and you can pick it apart, and things work for a reason. Structure is a big deal. Yeah, fun.
Indeed.
Little artistic nerd out there.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. So let me read a little bit more about this play, Lycidas. I wish I knew how to pronounce that. I can't believe I didn't look it up. Lycidas.
Lycidas. It would be Lycidas, Lycidas, if you were, or Lycidas if you were doing it in Latin with the hard C.
Okay.
See, so so we'd have to know if that's how they were pronouncing it or not. Probably Lycidas. Yeah. I don't know. Okay. If you like it, and you are a scholar of Latin pronunciation in early modern England, and you happen to know how that would have been pronounced during the period, we would love to hear from you genuinely. T.me/artofdarkpod. You can find us on the Bird website at artofdarkpod. And of course, we are at the website is artofdarkpod.com. You know where to find us. And truly, we welcome, whether it's on YouTube or Twitter or wherever else, comments. If we get something a little wrong, please tell us. We are lifelong learners here, if you can't tell.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah, we also don't pretend to be experts where we're not.
No.
I am refreshing.
I am certainly not a Milton. I am very far from a Milton expert. Yeah, this is like so I'm doing my best, and we've got good stuff here, but you're totally right. We're not really experts. We're exploring. So
there you go. There you go. Yeah.
So let me read this bit from the biography about this poem. Quote, "The main point of the poem is a search for consolation in the face of death. Each possible consolation is tried out and then found wanting or partial. Fame, for example, which is in the poem is called that last infirmity of noble mind. Fame, for example, which a young poet like Milton or Edward King might well imagine as a satisfying goal of his poetic endeavors, turns out to be deferred to the next world." Let's see. In the process of exploring the theme of false or problematic consolations, Milton discovered poetic devices that he was to use with increasing force and subtlety as his career developed. One is the long verse paragraph of irregular length that invites the reader in and then troubles him, a poetic form that Milton virtually invented. We wait for the verse paragraphs to resolve themselves. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Mainly iambic pentameters, the poem also contains occasional and surprising short lines, as well as an irregular rhyme scheme. Milton's musical training had made him one of the most subtle poets of sound in the language. Now, that's expressed as a virtue, and as we saw later, T.S. Eliot would sort of say that was Milton's weakness in some ways. So it's interesting. Now, I'm going to read a couple little bits from this poem because I want to get Milton's voice a little bit in our ear.
I topped off my water.
Excellent.
Yeah, I got to stay hydrated.
It's important to stay hydrated. Yeah. That is
because we're getting ready to head into hell.
Yes. Oh,
I think we are going to call this episode, Brad, John Milton, Party of the Devil.
Party of the Devil. I like that. I like that quite a lot.
You looking for your
no
page?
I missed the reference. That's not a big deal.
No worries.
There's, as we said, there's the consolation, the search for a consolation in the face of death, and the various things, and one's own death or somebody else's death, and the various ways in which the things that people tend to rely on don't work. There are at least two other recurring Miltonic themes that we see in this early poem. The first is the corruption of the church. Edward King had died before he became a minister, which Milton sort of seems to consider lucky, that Edward King had managed to escape getting pulled in as a minister of the church and being corrupted by it. And this isn't the Catholic Church. This is the Church of England. And he relates the corruption, and Milton relates the corruption of the church as a, quote, grim wolf. We also get a bit about hair, because Milton has to talk about hair. And hair plays a big role in one of the books in Paradise Lost as well. Like, for instance, this figure, Lycidas, who is standing in for Edward King in this poem, dies, goes to heaven, and the first thing he does is he washes his hair. So it's just Milton has a hair thing. Okay. 1637 or 38, Milton's younger brother Christopher. Milton, by the way, had a brother and a sister. So Anne, his sister, dies sometime in the 1640s. Christopher outlives Milton. In 1637 or 38, Milton's younger brother Christopher, who may have been a covert Catholic and would be a royalist during the upcoming Civil War, which is a big deal. He moves into the Milton home. He moves back in with mom and dad, and this freed up our John, who probably wasn't doing anything anyway, to give up any domestic responsibilities he had and go on a grand tour of Europe, financed, of course, by his father. Sometime in here, his mother died. I don't have the year in front of me, but basically, Milton's 30, coming on 30. He's been living at home for a number of years. His mother has passed. His dad's taken care of him, and he's going to go on a grand tour of Europe, aided by a manservant, which is just traveling in style. First, he goes to Paris. He didn't like France or the French. Later, when writing about education,
they come together. You gotta take them together.
Well, he didn't like either. So, later, when writing about education, Milton imagines that when education is reformed in England, then they'll no longer have to send over their brightest to France for learning, only to have them sent back as, quote, apes and mimics. Yeah, Italy, that's shots fired. Italy, according to Milton, was much better. He stayed in Florence for 5 months. He preferred
that's where the church is. That's where the Catholic Church is. What's going on, buddy?
Yeah, good question. He really appreciated how the academy was set up in Italy. It was more of a symposium kind of environment. It had debates and banquets, and it was much more to his liking. And Milton was actually quite well liked there. He made a number of friends at the academy. He also met Galileo, which is just fun. He mentions Galileo. Galileo is the only figure who sort of contemporary figure who is mentioned in Paradise Lost. And I really
missed my opportunity there.
Yeah.
Say Galileo again.
Galileo.
Galileo. Galileo Figaro. Yeah, anyway. There we go. Is that the first time that Galileo came up on the pod?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I think so.
Yeah, we'll have to do Galileo at some point.
That would be interesting for sure.
Yeah.
One thing it's kind of there's a moment of Milton meeting Galileo. At this time, Galileo's old and he's under house arrest and he's blind. Later, Milton would be blind. Milton would serve a very short time in prison, barely escaping much more serious charges. So there's and for I don't want to say similar reasons, but definitely for going against the authority at the time in their own ways. And so there is this way in which Milton sort of recapitulates a pattern that he saw in Galileo. Okay. Now, as you said, why is he going to Italy? Why does he like it so much? It is very curious because Milton hates Catholics, or hates Catholicism anyway. He's self-identifies as a Puritan. But he seems to do fine in Rome. He has a little bit of a difficulty with somebody he's staying with for a while who says, hey, who writes him a letter and basically says, like, it was nice having you. I would have been more hospitable if you would have not talked about religion so much.
Right. Imagine going to Rome as an early Protestant. You're just going, you're doing it wrong.
Right.
You're all wrong. Wrong. Now, where's my room and board?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Put me up in bad, like mediocre Italian with a thick accent. Yeah. You're doing it wrong.
Right.
Come on.
Very interesting. Now, he did meet a bunch of prominent cardinals and the like. I mean, he met a lot of people. And so he clearly wasn't
sure they were he was moving in a very sophisticated, highly educated circles, right?
So just kind of an interesting period. Now here's something that we're asking ourselves: hopefully a number of questions to this, but to T.S. Eliot's claim that Milton couldn't see, he's in Rome, he's writing diaries and many letters, and he never once mentions a piece of art. Now, I find that rather odd, personally. Like, if I'm not a diary keeper, Kevin, I don't know if you are, but let's say we were, and we went to Rome, and we were in Italy for 5 months. We don't even comment on a sculpture ever? That seems strange. So anyway, a scholar suggested maybe it's his Puritan iconoclasm. There's a certain that's not just for religious art, but it's somehow seeping out into all visual arts in some way. I'm not sure. It's just an interesting point. After Italy, he goes to Geneva, where he meets up with the uncle of his friend Charles Diodati, the guy who the letter to Charles Diodati is what I read earlier as sort of his manifesto. Here, Milton finds out that his friend has passed away in London. So this is striking. I mean, it's his best friend. He's 30-ish, and his best friend has just died. Sad. His first prominent poem is about a friend of his that died. I mean, life is very I mean, people die all the time, obviously, but at this time, as we're going to see, people are just gone a lot. And Milton has to deal with that. I mean, his first major poem is about trying to find consolation for death, other people's death and your own. Now, when he gets back home in 1639, the English Civil War is about to kick off. Now, I was going to put you in the hot seat, Kevin, and ask you to explain the English Civil War. However, I don't think I'm going to do that.
Thank you.
Unless you know a bunch already.
very little Cromwell.
Yeah. Okay.
And the Puritans and the monarchy was overthrown for a period of time, but then restored. Maybe I know more than I think I do, but
none of that's wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
And on my Irish side, Cromwell was a right bastard.
Yeah, he was.
He's not a good guy to the Irish.
I don't like him. I don't like him.
Yeah, I don't like him at all.
Okay, so I'm going to give you, this is important for Milton because this is the crucible in which Milton is ultimately formed. And so we need to know what was going on. And he ends up being very entangled in it. This is not something happening out there for him. This is happening in his life, in his world, on his streets sometimes. So here's my little spiel on the English Civil War. And forgive me, historians, if I get something wrong about this. Again, I cobbled this together the best I can. I don't think anything in here is wrong, but I may be missing some key points. So the English Civil War is actually a series of civil wars, and as Wikipedia calls it, political machinations, which I always love, between royalists and parliamentarians that begins with the Wars of the Three Kingdoms starting in 1639 and continues on into the 1650s, or in the opinion of T.S. Eliot, into the 20th century. So let's put a few stakes in the ground here. So we have King Charles I. Charles I was a believer in High Anglicanism, a sacramental version of the Church of England based on Arminianism. What is Arminianism? It is a theological school of thought whose core tenet, for our purposes at least, is rejection of predestination. As you may know, the Puritan and the Calvinist strains of Protestantism took this very seriously, basically on the flip side. So in the middle of the 17th century, when Charles tries to enforce, so he's a high Anglican, so he's still retaining aspects of Catholicism in what King Charles I believes how it should be practiced. He tries to enforce the very strongly Episcopalian model, bishops, on Scotland, and create a new uniform church through the land. But the Scots were having none of it. So King Charles ends up taking his forces to Scotland, and over the next 2 years fought an ineffective war to dominate the Scots. After which, the Church of England would no longer interfere with Scotland's religion. Kind of an interesting thing. However, in the attempt to do this, Charles I had to get the new parliament to give him money, which opened up an opportunity for parliamentarians to air a bunch of grievances. Charles I didn't like this, so he shut Parliament down. So this is an interesting thing where it's like, yes, we have a board of elected people who help to make the decisions through and are informed by the people. But as soon as they start doing something we don't like, we just shut that down. That's all just it's practically theater for people to feel like there's actually a process going on, right? Shutting down Parliament meant that he wouldn't be officially criticized or censured, but he also wouldn't get his money. So, funnily enough, he was also king of the Scots. So he had gone to war. He had to end up ultimately, in some ways, financing both sides of this war, at least paying for sort of the various reconstruction kind of things that happened on the back end of it. Eventually, unable to pull the money together without Parliament, he had to call Parliament back in. And this Parliament, which is known historically as the Long Parliament, was even more opposed to him than the previous Parliament. The Long Parliament instituted a bunch of new measures, particularly anti-papist laws, now to push back on Charles I's suspected Catholic tendencies. And one of the things Parliament did, is that they could no longer be dissolved. You can't shut Parliament down anymore. Okay, fair enough.
Perma Parliament.
Yeah.
Parliament forever.
Right. Long live Parliament. The Parliament is dead. Long live the Parliament. There was a series of extra legal correspondences and actions were also uncovered by Parliament. So there was sort of an investigation into what King Charles I had been up to. Significant among these was Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Stratford's insistence to the king that the king was outside of the law and could do anything he wanted in Ireland. Right? Okay. Wentworth, first Earl of Stratford, is executed by an act of Parliament in 1641 for giving this advice and for other things associated with it.
How'd they do him?
What's that?
How'd they do him? Behead him?
I'm not sure. I think they probably hung him. Yeah. There were also Parliament enacted new laws on taxation, how money was spent, etc. Some of this was probably fair, some of it wasn't. All of this kind of came to a head when the Irish Catholics, fearing a rise in Protestant power, right? Because the Catholics might not have liked King Charles I, but he had sort of Catholic tendencies, so maybe he was better than the Parliament who hated, does that make sense? It's sort of like
the devil you know.
Right, exactly. And it's like he might 2 out of 3 times he might screw us, but maybe 1 out of 3 we kind of, other than this new Parliament that's coming in is a problem.
Was the Parliament highly puritanical, these folks?
Yeah, very Protestant, and did contain a lot of Puritans as well. Yeah. So I think it's fair to say highly puritanical. In that definition,
lively parties,
right? In that definition of the Puritans as being purifying,
trying to purify
the Church of
Catholic elements. Indeed.
Yeah. So all this kicked off the Irish Rebellion of 1641. Ireland descended into total chaos. Parliament came to believe that Charles I supported Ireland in this rebellion. Charles I escalated this whole conversation by marching to the House of Commons with 400 soldiers and trying to arrest members of Parliament. This did not go over well. And then the English Civil War properly kicked off. Up till now, we were fighting the wars of the Three Kingdoms. Now, basically, obviously, maybe Parliament wanted more power and less for the king. And at first, it was sort of like, we're going to still share this, but Parliament just wants more. Eventually, it would become even more radical than that. Many people in the country were opposed to the king, as probably is almost always true, and most of the country, the common folk, really didn't care, supposedly, according to some accounts. It's sort of like now, where like 20 or 30% of people are super politically engaged, and most people are just kind of don't care. That's kind of how it always is throughout history. But the military, and it's important to have the military on your side if you're going to have a civil war pop off. The military tilted towards Parliament, right? This led to full-scale battles in various locations around England until Charles I was captured by the Presbyterian Scottish Army in 1646 and handed over to English Parliament, which imprisoned him. Okay. While Charles I was in prison, things chilled out for a little while. There was still a simmering power struggle between the Royalists, the Independents, the Army, the Presbyterians, Parliament, Scottish Parliament, all of that. It's sort of a power vacuum, right? The king managed to drive a wedge between the army and parliament. So army and parliament had been aligned against him. He managed to kind of split them apart to some extent, until the point where the Second English Civil War popped off in the summer of 1648.
Wait. So we had one, and then there was the king was imprisoned, and now we get to do English Civil War II, Civil War Boogaloo.
Yes.
Okay. Charles is back.
Yeah. Yeah. He's still in prison, actually.
But he's making moves. He's making moves from prison.
He's like a mob boss in prison, right? He's still like, you're
on to something. Right. Now you're speaking my language. All government is crime.
That's right. Now, this second one, again, series of battles, reversals, betrayals, mostly fought in England as opposed to Ireland and Scotland. At least that's my understanding of it. There are any number of historical events in this period that we could talk about, but probably the most important ones for our purposes are the trial of King Charles I by what's called the Rump Parliament, basically Parliament under hostage of the army, and when Charles I was beheaded in January of 1649 for being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy.
Man, if you're chopping off the head of the king,
it's a big deal.
Ooh, doggy.
Yeah. Now, the after his beheading, the war continued on for a number of months until it, quote, came to an end, as much as these things really ever end, when the parliamentarian troops under Oliver Cromwell defeated the Royalists and Royalist Scots in Lancashire in the summer of 1649. Now, I hadn't really mentioned Cromwell throughout this, because I wasn't really mentioning any individuals, but throughout this, Cromwell is rising in prominence from the beginning of it to the end. And just imagine he's just successful time and time again, until eventually he's the most competent guy in the room, right? He's a statesman.
Man, I've been there. I really relate to that.
Right. He's a statesman. He's a soldier. He's a military commander. He became this, up to the point, like I said, he's the senior member of the parliamentary army, and was, on top of these things, probably the loudest voice calling for the execution of Charles I. Like, to him, it was like, we can't just win, we have to cut his head off. Intense stuff, right? Now, following the execution, still kind of a power vacuum, right? Because it literally, again, who's in charge is just who's got the weapons, basically, right? Ultimately, in the end, whoever controls violence controls the levers. And so it's not 100% clear who has what, right? And there can be uprisings and various things. But eventually Cromwell is appointed Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He's basically a Caesar-like figure. He would reject the actual crown on 2 different occasions, but when he was officially appointed this, supposedly the ceremony was very much like a coronation. So the thing is, the English people, it's not like they have a bunch of different models for how to do this at the ready. Do you know what I mean? They've been coronating kings for generations. So now you got this new guy, and he killed the old king. So isn't he kind of the king? Right? Like, I think that's the sort of subconscious logic that most people would have been operating on.
We've always had a king here. You're the king now.
Right.
You killed the king. That makes you the king.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
How do you think his great granddad became king?
He killed another king, and now you're the king.
Yeah. Now,
but this is all tied up in like theological problems too. I mean, they sort of thought of Christ as King of Kings, and it goes deep. I mean, and the sovereignty is derived from God, and because of the king is the sovereign, it gives political legitimacy to whatever government is formed under the king. There's a lot of like real legitimate thinking, going on here,
and when you kill the king, and something like half the country believes that the king was appointed by God, that's a problem, right? You don't recover from that. That's, yeah. Now Cromwell, a bit of a villain to, I would say, a lot of people. Uh, uh, Here's a couple things that he did. um, he launched an Irish campaign from 1649 to 1650 to put down English royalists and, most importantly, Irish Confederate Catholics there. Of course, as we said, he did not care for the Catholic Church all that much. As part of this were a series of events, understatement. As part of this, there were a series of events such as the siege of Wexford, when Cromwell's men laid siege to the town and killed 2,000 Irish troops and 1,500 civilians and burned the town to the ground. There were other, that's maybe the most significant one there, but there were other events like this. The overall conquest effort went on for years until 1653, in which Catholicism was officially banned, priests were killed, and Catholic land was taken and given to Scottish England and English soldiers. This is in Ireland.
Very cool, guys. Very good. Yeah, good going. Yeah, look at the West now. Look at Europe now. Woo! Nice work.
What else was Cromwell? He was a bunch of things, but one thing is
unrelated to the Snackwell fortune.
Yeah,
here in America, this is a common misconception. Different family.
The Honeywells? Wait,
the Honeywells, the Snackwells, and the Cromwells.
Yeah.
One of these is delicious.
Cromwell was something else, too. Cromwell was John Milton's boss. John Milton would become what we call now in corporate speak a direct report to Oliver Cromwell. But we got to back up and explain how we get there. Okay. Milton, as we said, was traveling from 1638 and into 1639. And when we returned, you've got these preliminary conflicts, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, were just kind of starting up. He started, when he came back from his grand tour of Europe, he no longer lived in the family home, and he moved just outside of the city of London. His nephews, John and Edward would be the first person to write a biography of John Milton. And it's quite good. It's interesting. John and Edward came to live with him because Milton's sister had died, right? So he adopts the nephews. A single man adopts his nephews. Very interesting. And he takes fairly seriously takes upon himself their education, which is pretty cool. And Edward has nothing but good things. Well, maybe not nothing but good things to say, but mostly very good things to say about his uncle. He's there, he's reading, he's sort of trying to recommence his studious retirement, but the world's on fire around him, so it's not as easy as it once was to do. He wrote a number of tracts. He started writing tracts. This is when people would put out treatises and tracts and pamphlets. Now we use Twitter. It's not really that different in some ways.
Pretty cool to return to like writing a tract.
Right.
Be something kind of hardcore about that.
It would be.
So nobody will give you their home address, but I mean,
right. Yeah, that's the thing, is how would you distribute it?
You just do like a digital tract would be interesting.
Right. Yeah.
Like I'd really demand, like, put something out where like you can't even download it without printing it. Like do some sort of weird JavaScript, or I don't even know what you would do to that you've got to print this out.
It has to be physical. Yeah.
And it forces your printer to print 20 copies.
Right. And emails the link to your 20 most.
You can do a lot of damage that way. I had access in high school. I had access to like an industrial grade, like a commercial grade printer through one of the jobs I had. And I found on the internet, a one sheet about how public schools are similar to the prison system. And we maybe distributed 200 or 300 copies of those around the high school one day. And that maybe caused a few issues. I mean,
okay. Yeah. No, you were participating in a great tradition in which Milton also participated. So
some of the teachers were like, yeah, this is right.
They're like, the problem with this is it's not wrong. So
interesting times.
So he's writing these tracts, and again, we have to remember a couple of things about Milton. Super smart, super erudite, actually seems to like being attacked, or at least likes the game, likes the intellectual game of we're in a you're right, I'm right, you're wrong kind of mode, right? So he starts writing all these tracts, chiefly at first about church reform. He contributes to a pamphlet published under the name Schmectimnus, which is an acronym for its contributors, in which he speaks out against the bishops. So speaking out against the bishops is like speaking out against the king, right? But subtly. It's like speaking out against, yeah.
Schmecticus?
Schmectimnus. It's the acronym.
Schmectimnus.
It's the letters of the people's name, but
Sure,
they're like
okay.
semi-anonymous.
Fun.
From here, after contributing to this, Milton became more and more polemical. I think he liked playing the game of having these out there and people responding to them.
Posting edgelord.
A little bit, yeah. And he's writing these more, and he seems to be becoming more radical. I think as a teenager, he was a fairly conventional. He may have had started having strange ideas about religion, but probably politically was, maybe slightly on the parliamentary side. But he's getting more and more radical as things go on. He wrote a pamphlet on Reformation in the church, which is vitriolic, and in the first time in a public piece of writing, he is doing what somebody would call a scholar referred to as spitting. It's like venomous, and he'll go and ad hominem. Like, he does not have any problem about just attacking an individual person, and this accelerates through his life. This like amplifies in certain cases through his life. He did not. This is key. He did not submit these tracts and pamphlets and various things to either the Star Chamber or the Company of Stationers, which were supposed to control all elements of print culture at the time. So anything that came out was supposed to go through the official channels, and they'd sign off on it, basically, or not sign off on it. These were put out directly by print shops. So interesting. He writes all this stuff about bishops. He's railing hard against bishops. At the same time, 1641, Parliament passed a bill to abolish the bishops, right? So he's in the public discourse. How many people are reading the pamphlets? It's kind of hard to tell. I mean, I don't know how many people were reading anything at that time, really. I mean,
sure, but again, it doesn't matter. He's right at the heart of power in London. He's in central London. London's one of the capitals of the world. It has been for a long time.
Yeah.
And if you can get 500 of the right people to read the thing that you're passing around,
yeah,
that does it.
And two things, you got to think about the numbers and population. There's I think at this time, roughly London is 400,000 people. And in those 400,000 people are the king and Cromwell and, and a whole host of other people who have Wikipedia pages. You know what I mean? So you only it's a fairly small network, right? Before suddenly, maybe not the king, but it's not hard to imagine that somebody in the king's retinue had read a couple of these pamphlets.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
Somebody with the king's ear.
Yeah. So 1641, basically, he's got a career as a polemicist for a time. It's, let's see. So, I'll give you here's somebody attacked the Schmectimnus thing, and Milton wrote a response to the attack. And here's just an example of how he would go after somebody. Quote, "This tormentor of semicolons is as good at dismembering and slitting sentences as his grave fathers, the prelates, have been at stigmatizing and slitting noses." Which I don't even know exactly what that means. Like, I don't know what the slitting noses part is about, but just it's sort of, you mentioned battle rap earlier. There's like an element of this of like, well, I am wittier than you, and my attack will be more withering than yours. And it doesn't have to be intellectual or philosophically.
I just looked this up because I wanted to know, and I'm glad I did.
Yeah.
You look up slitting noses, and you see the first thing that comes up on Wikipedia is rhinotomy as a punishment for adultery, customary in early India, but also practiced by the Greeks and Romans.
So interesting. Yeah.
Accusing him of being an adulterer.
Right.
clever way. Do you want to read it one more time? Read it one more time.
Yeah, this tormentor, and he's talking about the attack, somebody attacking his people. His homies have been attacked, and he's responding. This tormentor of semicolons is as good at dismembering and slitting sentences as his grave fathers, the prelates, had been at stigmatizing and slitting noses.
Yeah, right. So he's talking about the prelates. Who are the prelates? Are those the like bishops or?
I think those would be something in the bishopry. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's accusing the prelates of being adulterers and talking about stigmatizing too. That's a play on words because it calls to the stigmata of Christ.
Right.
And probably also it's got multiple meanings. Yeah, this dude's playing on that level. Yeah, he's not quite at like Jay-Z's level.
No,
like Jay, but he's
right. Yeah, he didn't ether this guy. Yeah, but
no, I feel like okay, all right, yeah.
No, but Milton would take. See, the thing is too, in these things, Milton is always imagining himself as sort of a public figure, even before he actually is one. And he's also keeping in mind, which is the way to do it if you're trying to become a public figure, by the way. And he also would sometimes in these tracts would just like go on for a page about his plans to write poetry and then like descend back into like calling out bishops or whatever, which is pretty fun.
Just wait and see. I haven't even dropped the real shit yet. You have no idea what's coming.
Exactly. Yeah. He also gets attacked at one point for spending time in brothels. And this is the thing about him. There's no way he spent time in brothels. Like, he may be guilty of various heresies and that sort of thing. Milton was, it would seem, this is my term for it, but this is from touching on it in various sources. I think Milton was far too sexually neurotic to have been going to brothels. I think he had some kind of weird hang up. It was partially religious. It was probably partially personal. Who knows what else was going on? But, and Milton got this, like, you've been going to brothels, and he thought, aha, here is an opportunity for me to spend 4 pages defending my virtue. Right? You know what I mean? Just like,
I don't even know what a brothel is.
Right. But you could see he's having fun. He likes this stimulus and being provoked, and like, I'll write this and then they'll write it back, and
this stance, this again, not much has changed. I mean, you go to PolitiFact now and they basically, it's just grown adults trolling social media going, liar, pants on fire, you're a liar, you're a lie, this person's a liar, did you see? I mean, it's just like, you say what you want about this, the stakes are real, and it is fun, and it is entertaining. And I imagine in this day and age too, again, you can't flick the radio on, you can't binge Netflix. It's a thing to frickin' do.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So this process is, and he's sort of gradually rising to prominence, and you can almost imagine Cromwell's rise to prominence on the battlefield and as a military commander, and then Milton's sort of intellectual and polemical rise to power sort of happening at the same time. That would be, I think, a fair way to kind of imagine this. In 1642, Milton gets married, which is interesting. His first wife was the daughter of a man who owed Milton's father money, and hadn't really been paying up since the 1620s. They were married quite rapidly, and Mary Powell moved from her noisy, busy house with a bunch of family into Milton's quiet apartment home that had been set up for studious retirement. Right.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, my dear. This is my man cave.
Right. And it's just books. That's all he does all day. And then just writes withering attacks that go out, and she's just like, just like a girl from the country who's used to having her family all around.
True love.
Yeah. It did not go well. Let me read a little bit from the biography about this. Yeah. Quote, "It is not hard to imagine how problems developed." This is between Mary Powell and Milton. "All Milton's biographers do so in their own way, with varying degrees of imagination or sympathetic engagement with one or both members of the couple. Mary was young, but she had grown up in a noisy home, a country estate, not a city household. At first, Milton must have seemed attractively different, clever, deeply interesting, musical, good-looking, a man in the prime of his life. But when did they have a chance to be alone together or to explore each other's difference or sexuality? Remember, Milton has little kids, his nephews are around, right? And for a little while, some of Mary Powell's family is there too. If they did have sex, what was it like? Milton admired women, but his only close relationship had been with this Charles Diodati, and he was dead. Milton had read a lot about sex and its effects in the course of his intense and wide reading, but he had no personal experience. So he'd never had sex at this point. Mary, so much younger as she was also likely to have been inexperienced. When her family went back to Oxford, Milton returned to his studies and teaching duties, and the house was suddenly quiet. One more little bit here on this. This is a quote from Edward Phillips. This is Milton's nephew who wrote the first biography of Milton. And this is talking about Mary Powell. And he would have been there when Mary Powell showed up. He would have been a young boy. Quote, she had for a month or thereabout led a philosophical life after having been used to a great house and much company. Her friends, possibly incited by her own desire, made earnest suit by letter to have her company the remaining part of the summer, which was granted on her condition of her return at the time appointed. So she goes to the house, she lives with Milton, and I think I might have this wrong, but it's not far off. It's either 2 months or 4 months she lives at Milton's home, and then she goes back to her family. And this causes some issues, and there are a number of reasons why. One, she wasn't apparently happy. Two, the Powells were royalists, so you have to imagine she's from a royalist family. She's probably a royalist in her own, depending on how much she even thinks about political matters. And then this guy is the most prominent blogger on the other side of the aisle. Right? That's how you kind of have to picture it. So her family,
and her dad owes his dad money, and there's some sort of other weird arrangement going on.
Yeah.
Awkward.
Right. Now
she's from MAGA country,
right?
And he's he's writing about Dark Brandon all day,
right, something like that, or the opposite, sure,
or vice versa.
So interesting, and this fact that she basically just bailed on him becomes important to some of his writing shortly, as we'll see. But nonetheless, after she leaves, there's the other factor going on, that the Civil War is about to happen, and basically everybody knows it. You can imagine that it's just tense, and somebody's waiting for that one thing to happen, right? And it's gonna happen any second. So we need to look, as the Civil War kind of kicks off, Milton's direct impacts to his personal life. His wife had left. His brother, serving in the Royal Army, went into hiding in 1643 to avoid prison, and wasn't seen by another member of his family for years. Parliament, in an effort to clamp down on the proliferation of printing presses and, quote, prompted by threats of conspiracies, suddenly passed a bunch of strict laws on writing. So they were very concerned that people might be spreading conspiracy theories or conspiracies, and they had to shut down the printing presses. Let me read a little bit about this.
The playbook is very old, people.
Right. Quote, during the same period, religious affairs also came to a head. The Westminster Assembly of Divines was established to advise Parliament. It was stacked with Presbyterians, many from Scotland, a sign of dependence on Scots troops, and it pressed the authorities to establish a national church and eliminate heresies, sects, and schisms. It insisted on the Scots Presbyterian model of church governance, highly centralized and dominated by the clergy. Independents, who were becoming stronger, argued for broad-based toleration of all Protestant sects, and some even for all Christians, including Roman Catholics. These differences gave rise to some of the sharpest and most unforgiving polemics of the period. Intolerance could not be tolerated. In September 1643, Parliament adopted the Solemn League and Covenant, which attempted to establish a unified Reformed church throughout the realm, and yet allowed for the king's authority, quote, in the preservation and defense of the true religion and liberties of the kingdoms. Milton soon contributed major publications to all these burning issues. And another one that he contributed to was Marriage and Divorce. Mary Powell had left him. And suddenly, one of the most important subjects amidst the Civil War for Milton to write about is divorce. He finds it very important that, hey, there should be ways. How's a man supposed to get divorced around here?
I want to get out of here. What is going on? She's already gone.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not
exactly. Well,
we're
and
not
you can
married.
right. Well, and for all of the, I don't want to get into debate about divorce necessarily, but there is one of the issues kind of was, so England is basically not, at this time, is not a Catholic country anymore. And it's not even that there was prohibition against divorce. It was like there was no laws about it at all. Like, and so it became,
But there were no right, because I mean it's a religious institution, and in the eyes of the church, and this still continues to this day in the one true faith in the Catholic Church, that if you're married in the church, you cannot be remarried to another person in the church. There is no divorce in the Catholic Church.
Right.
The church has to find that and annul the marriage. They basically have to say, for whatever reason, spiritual reason, it can require an investigation. So divorce is largely a secular. It's like a secular sort of idea.
Right. But even so I think, and I might be getting this slightly wrong, but I think part of the issue for Milton and for other people, the church had, when the church was in, it may have been very difficult to get an annulment, but at least it was a process that could be gone through. With the church gone, there was basically left with like nothing. So it was very uncertain, like what you couldn't get annulled. Like you couldn't get annulled. There was no process at all to be followed. And so this is kind of an issue, right? And you've got Milton, his wife just left. Like, what's he supposed to do?
This reminds me of one of my favorite jokes. Why is divorce so expensive? Because it's worth it. Have you ever heard that?
I have heard that.
Let's just leave that, put that in the air, and I hope everybody's very happy in all of their relationships.
Of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Milton writes these tracts on divorce. First, he's writing them anonymously and off license. Eventually, he starts putting his name on them, which, if you're like the only person out there arguing for something like divorce, any kind of policy that like liberalizes from the old order, and you're the only person saying it, it's going to attract some attention that most of us probably wouldn't want. Milton seemed okay with that sort of attention. Let me read you a little bit about his argument. Quote, opposed to scriptural authority, Matthew 19, 3-9, much of Milton's argument hangs on his view of human nature and the purpose of marriage, which, rather than the traditional ends of procreation or a remedy against fornication, he defines as, quote, the apt and cheerful conversation of man with woman to comfort and refresh him against the evils of solitary life. End quote. Milton argues that if a couple be, quote, mistaken in their dispositions through any error, concealment, or misadventure, for them spite of antipathy to fadge together and combine as they may to their unspeakable wearisomes and despair of all sociable delight, this violates the purpose of marriage as mutual companionship. So he's redefining what marriage is even about, as opposed to what probably most people at the time would have considered it. This, as you can imagine, brought public condemnation for Milton as a libertine, which wasn't true, and certainly not in his actual day-to-day behaviors. He wasn't any kind of libertine, and yet he's so articulate at putting these things together that oftentimes people he doesn't necessarily find common cause with will glom onto his arguments and use them for their own purposes. For instance, some of the ranters, there's a group of people called the Ranters, which was is really a hodgepodge of dissenting groups of commoners.
I'm in that group chat.
Yeah, right. It was a bunch of. It's not really a uniform group of any kind. It was a bunch of people who had like kind of pantheistic or antinomian ideas. They used Milton's arguments to justify spouse swapping. But here's
Oof.
Yeah. Here is where we start to see Milton actually having what seems to be an influence. Milton addresses the Westminster Assembly in 1643, and about divorce, and not long after, Parliament changed the law to allow for divorce in cases of infidelity or abandonment, which is, I think he had a big say in this. And I think most people would say those are, if somebody abandons you, I feel like you should be able to do something about it, right?
It depends on what you understand the nature of marriage to be.
True. Right.
Itself. It's
Right.
quite a serious thing.
Yeah. And these things have major stakes to them. The how it's socially thought of, what the rules are about it. It's all very, very important. And we see, I think, Milton, at least having some level of influence on the course of things in this regard. And this would be 1643. So he's 35 years old. Of course, Milton's perceived libertinism. You've got people on the other side just making these arguments he's making. They're just digging in harder. Many people were starting to call, because of his divorce tracts, we're starting to call for even harsher control on published materials, right? So it was like, we got to stop this guy from publishing these things. He says that if you're abandoned, you should be able to get divorced, and we can't, it's like, the well-known clergyman and documenter of heresies, that's quite a job for you, Ephraim Paget, said that the quote, the extremists preach, print, and practice their heretical opinions openly. For books witness a tractate of divorce in which the bonds are let loose to inordinate lust. That was about Milton. Okay.
Yeah, because these guys are rightly thinking like people are going to abuse this. It's tricky because you can't have it. You cannot have it both ways. It's very difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
And anytime you try to set up some system, there's always going to be some loopholes in it. Like, you're right. People are going to take advantage of it. It's right.
I tell you what, the world really started going to hell when John Milton wrote that tract about divorce in 1630-ish something. I can imagine we'd be at the bar. We really got to go back, man.
There we were, England, 1643.
Fucking libertine John Milton. Paradise Lost is all right, but you really got to read his tract on divorce and how that influenced Parliament, man. Because I'm a child of divorce, and because of that, that's why I didn't get. That's why the record deal fell through,
right?
And where,
yeah. I get
the bartenders looking at everybody in the bar at the bar.
It's like, yeah. But the thing is, there probably were people in the pub saying things like that, literally, like down the street from Parliament, right?
Mm-hmm. Just another little sidebar with the drunken bass player in Kevin's head.
Right.
He's always in there.
I love it.
Okay, fun.
Now, because of these attacks, these personal attacks, and these attempts to lock down publishing, Milton responds with probably what most people would argue is his finest polemical work, and this is a work called Aeropagitica. Now, the subtitle should tell you what it's all about. Quote, a speech of Mr. John Milton for the liberty of unlicensed printing to the Parliament of England. Excuse me, this was published in November of 1644, height of the war. Now, let me read a couple bits about this. This is a really important text because it's, we'll see here in a second. Okay. Quote, contemporaries such as the leveler William Walwyn, the Levelers was another one of these sort of ideological groups. You had a whole carnival of different ideological groups sort of trying to find purchase in this like chaotic system that was falling apart, basically.
It's like the Warriors, but they're writing letters to each other.
Right. William Walwyn had read enough Montaigne to have learned the importance of toleration from his religious skepticism. Milton now went even further in Aeropagitica. Quote, a man may be a heretic in the truth is the startling paradox he there formulates. There's another quote from it. And if he believes things only because his pastor says so, though his belief be true, yet the truth he holds becomes his heresy. Interesting. Okay. Milton challenges his readers to exert their own judgment and goes even further than Paul, who in 1 Corinthians argued that, quote, there must be heresies among you. Milton refers to the heresy hunters of the early church who, quote, discover more heresies than they well confute, and that oft for heresy, which is the truer opinion, quote, end quote. This last phrase gives the essence of Milton's reason for allowing a wide variety of opinion to flourish. Yeah, now there's one other bit. I read the bit about books. I feel like there might have been one other bit. No, we'll come to it in a second. So this basically, if you want to boil it down, basically what this Aeropagitica comes down to, and it's a long piece, he's arguing for freedom of speech. He's basically saying, like, you can't shut this stuff down. We have to be allowed to talk. And he's making many of the same arguments for freedom of speech that we hear now. Whatever your feelings about them are, he would have been pretty hard, especially at this time, hard on the side of people should be able to print whatever they want. And we certainly can't be submitting our writings to the state before it becomes publicly available. Otherwise, yeah. So I think everybody's already. It's interesting. It's not that John Milton is the first person to make any of these arguments, but he perhaps articulated them as well or better than anyone had up until that time. And again, he's growing in prominence, and he's writing this in the heart of the English Civil War. You have, and it's been influential for a long time. I'm just going to read a couple things from the Wikipedia just to give you a sense of the influence of Aeropagitica. Okay. The United States Constitution, which includes the prohibition against prior restraint or pre-publication censorship, is a direct reference to John Milton's Aeropagitica.
Prior restraint. You can't. Yeah. I'm free. How does it? What does he say at the cafe?
I don't remember exactly. I wish I could rattle it off. But yes, Walter Sobchak's talking about prior restraint.
The Supreme Court has roundly rejected prior restraint or something. Yes. So funny.
Yeah, and Milton may have even he didn't come up with the words prior or restraint, but I think he may have coined that as a phrase, as like a legal term.
Yeah, the connection between John Milton and Walter Sobchak is underreported, underdiscussed.
Yeah, that's a thesis topic for some of you out there.
You go.
If you wanted to write it. Milton argued that the prohibition against prior restraint is necessary because to threaten censorship prior to publication would have a chilling effect on expression and speech. It'll put the cop in your head. Here's another thing where we still see its influence. That quote from earlier, quote, a good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured upon to purpose to a life beyond life. That is over the entrance to the main reading room of the New York Public Library. The Supreme Court of the United States referred to Aeropagitica in interpreting the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. The court has cited Aeropagitica by name in at least 4 cases. Most notably, the court cited it in the New York Times Company versus Sullivan to explain the inherent value of false statements. The inherent value of false statements. Think about that little turn of phrase there. The court cited Milton to explain the dangers of prior restraint in Times Film Corporation versus City of Chicago. Later, Justice Douglas concurred in Eisenstadt versus Baird, citing the pamphlet to support striking down restrictions on lecturing about birth control. Finally, Justice Black cited Aeropagitica when he dissented from the court's upholding of restrictions on the Communist Party of the United States against the free speech and free association challenge in Communist Party of the United States versus the Subversive Activities Control Board. So anyway, this is something that's, up into almost contemporary time, people are relying on Aeropagitica almost as though it's a legal document in the American system, right? So very interesting. Let's see. Oh, in this
I
time too.
did not know this, and that is fascinating.
Yeah,
I am on the Aeropagitica website, the Wikipedia, right now, doing a little bit of reading.
Yeah, if you see something interesting that I kind of glossed over or just didn't say anything about, let me know. But fundamentally, what's worth knowing here is it's like this burning statement in favor of free speech, in particular in writing, and influential to this day, influential at its time even. He's also at the same time writing some other things. He writes a treatise on called Of Education, which I briefly mentioned before. Let me see if I think I have this highlighted here. A little bit about his attitudes on education, so you can kind of imagine what's in this Of Education treatise. But this is from the Forsyth biography. And this is really more of a description of how he was tutoring his nephews, and he would start to tutor some other boys as well. But it's also obviously, part of how he wrote about what an education should be like. Quote, education began with topics based on the senses, ancient texts about agriculture and geography, then the natural sciences, such as astronomy and physics, then the practical sciences of architecture, engineering, zoology, anatomy, and medicine. Gradually, the students would also be reading the poetry of nature, such as Virgil's Georgics and Lucretius. Soon their studies introduced them to moral philosophy, Plato, Cicero, Plutarch, but mingled with readings of scripture. They read choice comedies and tragedies, too, for relaxation, and learned, quote, at any odd hour, the Italian tongue. After some politics and law, they moved on to the climax of logic, rhetoric, and poetics. The program sounds extraordinary, perhaps, and indeed has little to do with modern systems, because there are at least one institution known to me, the biographer, Bard College in the USA, which tries to follow a pale variant of such a curriculum, introducing students via Latin and Greek to everything from mathematics to poetry. Milton's educational system is, like most of his work, based on an ideal, but that does not mean it is entirely out of reach. Edward Phillips, the nephew we've mentioned a couple times, confirms that this was more or less how the program actually went. It has also included some physical exercise before lunch, music with and after the meal, plus 2 hours of riding and military activities, swordsmanship or fencing before supper. Young men so prepared should be ready to govern, to fight, and to farm. And I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of goofy-looking anonymous accounts on the Bird website that are probably nodding along right now. Yeah,
right. Yeah,
it's not a bad program for homeschooling. Like at 3 o'clock, we try to stab each other. That's
right.
Having been a fencer, chess with knives. It's a very good. Yeah. It's a great sport.
I'm sure I've
trains the mind. You'd be very good at it. Maybe we'll get some fencing gear on one day, Brad. Yeah. That would be pretty fun.
That would be fun.
I'm in my 40s now, though, man. That is a young man's game. Is that right? I tell you what. Oh yeah.
1645. 1645. So 1644 was that Of Education. 1644 is also where Aeropagitica comes out. And then 1645, he publishes a collection of poems. So imagine, he's one of the most prominent writers of pamphlets and tracts and things like that. He writes this huge statement for free speech that's still referred to sometimes now. He writes this big thing on Of Education that was, though it wasn't perhaps influential in the notion of it actually lasting into current systems, it was certainly read by a wide number of people and thought about and discussed. And then he publishes a collection of poems in 1645 while the English Civil War is raging all around him.